The wagon creaked like an old confession as it rolled into Dry Creek, its wooden wheels groaning against the hard-packed earth. And Eli Mercer stood apart from the small crowd with his hat pulled low, fingers stiff around the folded letter that had promised him a wife. Because promises were easier on paper than in life. And Eli had learned long ago not to expect much from either. The ranch had taught him that, the years of silence. The way the land answered only when it wanted to, and as the wagon slowed, dust curling up like smoke around the horse's legs, Eli felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came whenever hope tried to settle somewhere it didn't belong. Because hope had a habit of leaving him exposed, and he was a man who had survived by keeping his expectations small and his walls high, yet here he was, waiting for a woman he had never met, a mail-order bride chosen out of loneliness and necessity, not romance because the winters were cruel. The nights longer, and even the strongest men grew tired of eating alone. The driver climbed down, shouting names. Parcels were handed off, laughter rippled through the crowd. And then the driver called out the name written so carefully in Eli's letter, the name he had whispered to himself on sleepless nights. And Eli stepped forward just as a woman rose from the wagon seat, blocking the sun for a heartbeat, her boots hitting the ground with a thud that seemed to echo. And Eli froze because she was nothing like the woman he had imagined in his mind's quiet corners. She was tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who had wrestled life and refused to lose. Her dress plain but sturdy, her arms strong, her presence undeniable. A woman twice his size stepping down with a confidence that parted the crowd without a word. And the murmurs began immediately, sharp and curious, some amused, some cruel. And Eli felt heat crawl up his neck as he realized every eye was flicking between them, measuring, judging, deciding who had made the mistake. The woman met his gaze head-on, her eyes steady and unafraid. And in them Eli saw not apology, not shame, but resolve, the kind forged in hardship. And when she spoke his name, it wasn't tentative. It was firm, like she had already decided she belonged somewhere, and was daring the world to disagree. And Eli swallowed because he didn't know how to answer a woman who took up space in a world that had taught him to shrink. And the silence stretched long enough for old wounds to stir, the memory of his father's disappointed stare, the whispers after his mother died, the years of being the quiet Mercer boy who stayed on the edges, until finally he nodded, because nodding was safer than speaking. And the woman smiled, not sweetly but knowingly, as if she understood something about him that even he hadn't put into words yet. Introductions were exchanged, awkward and brief, hands clasped, hers warm and calloused, his rough but hesitant. And Eli felt something shift, subtle but undeniable, like the land just before a storm. And as they walked away from the wagon together, the crowd slowly dispersing behind them, Eli became acutely aware of how small he felt beside her, and how strangely, unsettlingly, that didn't feel like a threat. But Dry Creek had a way of turning curiosity into cruelty, and whispers followed them down the street, questions hanging in the air, because this was not the story the town expected. And Eli knew the ranch wouldn't be any kinder, the work unforgiving, the neighbors watchful. And as they reached the hitching post where his horse waited, the woman, Clara, she said her name was, looked out toward the distant hills with an expression that mixed caution and determination. And she told him she hadn't come all this way to be turned around by stares or doubts, that she'd survived worse than whispers. And Eli believed her because the truth sat solid in her voice. And for the first time in years, he wondered if loneliness had led him not into mistake but into challenge, one that would test everything he thought he knew about strength, partnership, and himself. And as they rode out of town together, the sun dipping low and the road stretching ahead like an unanswered question, Eli felt the weight of the letter in his pocket finally ease, replaced by something heavier and far more dangerous, possibility. And if you want to see how this unlikely meeting reshapes both there, lives in ways no one in Dry Creek could have predicted, stay with this story. Because what comes next will challenge every expectation. And subscribing now means you won't miss a single chapter of the journey that's only just begun. The ranch revealed itself slowly as the road narrowed and the sky widened, rolling fields giving way to fences that leaned with age and wind. And Eli rode ahead in silence, aware of Clara's steady presence behind him, the sound of her breathing unlabored, unafraid, as if distance and uncertainty were old companions rather than threats. And when the house finally came into view, weathered wood, a porch that sagged just enough to show its years, smoke rising thin from the chimney, Eli felt a familiar tightening, the reflexive urge to apologize for a life that had been built for survival, not comfort. But Clara dismounted without hesitation, boots hitting the ground like a declaration. taking in the land with eyes that measured not what was lacking but what could be made strong. And she said simply that it was good land, honest land. Words that surprised him because no one had ever spoken kindly about the Mercer Ranch except him, and even then only in private. The days that followed tested them both in ways no letter could have prepared them for. Because ranch life did not pause for introductions or expectations. Fences needed mending, cattle wandered, storms rolled in without warning, and Clara worked alongside Eli from the first light to the last. Her strength undeniable, her endurance steady, and though the neighbors came by under the excuse of courtesy, their eyes lingered too long, their questions edged with disbelief. And Eli felt the old instinct to retreat, to shield himself with silence. But Clara met every look head-on, not with defiance but with calm certainty. And slowly, grudgingly, the whispers softened into curiosity. At night, the house felt different, no longer hollow with echo, but filled with the quiet sounds of another presence. The scrape of a chair, the soft exhale of breath, and though they slept in separate rooms, Eli found himself listening for those sounds, reassured by them, unsettled by how much he wanted them to remain. And Clara, for her part, carried her own ghosts, revealed not in speeches but in scars, in the way she flinched at raised voices, in the careful way she folded her few belongings. And one evening, as rain battered the roof and thunder rolled across the hills, she told him in a low, steady voice that she had learned early how quickly kindness could turn conditional, how strength was something the world demanded from women like her, long before it ever offered acceptance. And Eli listened, truly listened, and understood for the first time that loneliness did not always look like isolation. Sometimes it looked like standing in plain sight and never being chosen. Conflict came as it always does, sharp and unexpected, when a neighboring rancher laughed openly at Eli in town, making a cruel joke that cut deeper than fists ever could, and Eli felt the familiar shame burn hot. But before he could shrink back, Clara stepped forward, her voice firm, unyielding, and told the man that courage was not measured by sighs or sneers. And the silence that followed was heavier than any insult, because the crowd had seen something shift, had seen Eli not as a punchline, but as a man worth standing beside. And later, alone under a sky littered with stars, Eli confessed his fear, that he was not enough, that he had never been enough, and Clara told him that being enough was not about fitting expectations but about showing up when it mattered. And as the seasons turned, the ranch began to change, not dramatically, not magically but steadily. Fences straightened, crops grew stronger, laughter, rare and unpracticed, found its way into the evenings. And Eli realized that love, real love, was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to remain despite it. And when the town finally accepted Clara not as a curiosity but as a force, it was not because she had changed herself, but because she had refused to. And Eli, standing beside her, no longer felt small, because he understood now that partnership did not mean being overshadowed. It meant being supported. And if this story of unexpected strength, quiet resilience, and a love that defied appearances has moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel so you can continue following stories.